Today we're going to be talking about an interesting phenomenon that's part of not just American government, but a lot of Western governments and all sorts of different kinds of governments. And what we're talking about is interest groups, because from the founding of this country, the idea of an interest group being an important part of the country was never actually really thought of something that was designed constitutionally. It just kind of naturally happened as we went along. Now, I mean, it didn't come as a surprise that Madison originally pointed out, hey, this sort of thing is going to happen. People are going to break off into factions and all that. And so interest groups kind of became that faction, or one of those types of things that illustrate factions. And so what an interest group actually is an organized group of people who share common goals, and they're actively attempting to influence the government, um, um, government policymakers through direct and indirect methods. And they'll do all sorts of things to get what they actually want done, but they're not actually elected officials themselves, although they can be elected officials that actually act as interest groups to make these sorts of things happen. And so what's important to point out is there's a lot of criticism against interest groups out there, but they are protected by the First Amendment, which is really important. I mean, because citizens and groups of citizens are allowed to lobby members of Congress and government officials, which is exactly what most interest groups tend to actually do, especially on the national level. They also have state levels. So, I mean, this isn't just a national phenomenon. It involves pretty much all, anywhere from state to local to, anytime you're influencing a government official to do something, or somebody who's part of a decision-making process, basically you're an interest group. So, I mean, there are even interest groups towards, business entities rather than just, government. So it's these types of people who use either their clout, their knowledge, and influence or influence in order to get things done for the people that they're actually representing. And sometimes they're hired by people, sometimes they're just drafted by people, as a representative of a group or an ideology in order to get something done. So they'll either, like I said, at least for the national level, let's talk about that. They'll lobby members of Congress and government officials. One of the other actions they take is they'll actually sue the government. So you'll have a lobbyist group that actually will sue the government because of whatever malfeasance or type of activity that they think shouldn't be done, or they'll submit petitions to the government. And so these are kind of some of the things that they actually do. So why do interest groups form? Because, like I said, it was not originally part of the founding fathers' idea of let's have interest groups in order to make things done. They didn't make it like a fourth branch of government. They just kind of formed, and they formed because people got together and realized that they could get things done collectively much more than they could individually. Because if say a member of Congress is trying to make a decision, and one person in his community comes to him and says, we need to do this because it would make things better, that might influence him or her. However, if 100 people come to him, represented by one person or how many, that member of Congress is going to look at that and go, there's a lot of people who I represent that actually want this, or doesn't necessarily have to be people even he or she represents, but people who have some kind of other influence, like maybe they're future voters, or maybe they have a lot of money that might actually go towards a campaign or something to that effect. Well, that will cause that particular person to go, maybe I should start thinking about this. Now, it may not change a person's opinion, but what it may actually do is influence a decision. And so if somebody's, coming to the point where he or she has to decide yes or no on a particular issue, that person may go into whatever their decision process is and go, I remember when 100 people came to me and wanted this, as opposed to nobody coming to me wanting the opposite. Therefore, it might be better in my interest and behoove me to actually decide this particular direction rather than something else. Uh, Sometimes interest groups will form because, well, one thing that kind of happened in our government is as we became bigger and bigger, we started off with our 13 colonies and got, 13 states, and then became, 15 states, and just kept growing and growing. Well, as more government came along, there's a need for more interest groups. They can also form as a response to a threat, or a situation that has happened that's caused people to be concerned for some reason. An example is like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. A situation was happening. I mean, it had been happening for a while, but a group of people got together and realized collectively we can get something done, as opposed to just kind of relying on government to eventually get there on their own, because sometimes it doesn't. And so this helped to influence things, and that's why you have these things like you'll have Emily's List and all of these different kind of groups that are interest groups, that influence decisions kind of going forward. Also, influential leaders, they'll establish groups, to get people to do certain things. So if they have a certain idea that's kind of something they've wanted to have done for a while, what they'll do is they'll put together a group, an interest group, to actually represent that specific idea, and then it kind of gains a life of its own and then continues on from there. So examples are like, like the National Rifle Association and stuff like that. I mean, all designed off of, supporting a particular amendment, put together by a group of people who thought they needed to do this for some other specific purpose. And then that purpose is like evolved over time, as, the world changes. It's just kind of how things actually work. So what causes people to want to join an interest group? Well, usually we think of three main reasons, which is the purposive incentive, I need to get actually something done. A solitary incentive, like there's one thing that you really, really want to have happen. Again, example is like the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the specific reason to stop drunk drivers from, killing people. Or material incentives, you're doing things in order to, make profit, or to make better profit, or to save your company's profits, or whatever may actually be the result of that. So there are a couple of problems to point out, and let me kind of frame the reference of this. Mancur Olson was an economist. Well, he's all sorts of different things, but for the purpose of this, we'll talk about the economist. He wrote The Logic of Collective Action and the Rise of the Decline of Nations. And so he presented this idea of what's called Freeriders. And what happens is when you have a movement going, and I'll give you an example, is the civil rights movement. There were attempts to get things out, or even a better example is the poor people's movement. Back in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, kind of moved forward from there. There was this move in order to make it so people who basically had no money and no resources, to band them together as one solid group in order to make government actually do something about it. So they got all of these people together to this huge march on Washington, and got to Washington, got all these people together, demanded change, demanded results. They were going to keep standing in the streets until they actually got what they wanted. And they actually got a couple of small little, things from the government, some ideas or processes the government promised to actually do that they could immediately see the results of. And so they were really happy and kind of went back home. And then the next year decided to go back because, it did not solve poverty. So went back the next year. And so like in the beginning, brought 1 million people out there, and the next year, basically about 10,000 people showed up. And so what had happened is, it's not that the needs of the organization had changed, because basically government looked at the smaller number of people and kind of went, why should we do anything? It's not like you have any real support anymore. And what had happened is the people who wanted the things done were still there, but the people who stayed home the second time around kind of thought, well, we got what we wanted last time. And last time I was there, there were, hundreds of thousands of people around me. So they'll all show up, so we can still get the things we want done, but I'm going to stay home and watch Jeopardy. And so what happened is they didn't realize that all their neighbors kind of felt the same way. And so everyone stayed home. Very few people supported it. And so they did what's called free riding, which is they were hoping that, they could collect the goods of what were actually being achieved, without actually having to do the work to make it actually happen. And that becomes a huge problem with most collective goods issues, is free riders have a tendency of just kind of, they benefit from the interest group, but they don't contribute. And sometimes the interest group fails completely because there's nobody supporting it in order to make it actually happen. So let's talk about interest groups and public goods, because I mentioned goods. So all members benefit from a successful interest group, and that's where those public goods come, is those public goods are the result of whatever you've actually done. And so free riders can actually, be a problem. And so the only way to really overcome free riders, and this is something not a lot of interest groups solve and then pretty much dissolve because of it, but the ones that do solve it realize it, and what they'll do is they can be overcome by societal pressure or government actions in order to make sure that free riders are no longer able to benefit from the resources that are achieved by the benefits that kind of come from it. And so a lot of unions have actually done that sort of thing, whereas certain areas don't want union membership. So what they'll do is they'll try to destroy a union, and the people who are now, and so they'll make it so a union is no longer required in order to have a job. And so what will happen is a union will then sometimes create benefits only to the people who have actually signed up and not make them available to everybody, because free riders have a real tendency to want to collect the same benefits without actually doing any of the work in order to make things happen. So let's talk about interest groups and how they serve a couple of different purposes. For one, they bridge the gap between citizens and government. One of the problems we have in the United States specifically, and there's a couple of other countries that have this problem as well, is we're huge. And because we're so big, what happens is it's the connection between government and common citizens becomes less and less. So your interest group kind of serves as a bridge between those two things. So by allowing government to see that all of these people need this particular resource, and then kind of serves as the mechanism to make that resource actually happen. So those individual citizens still get what they were supposed to get in the first place, but now government knows that they actually need to do it. They also raise public awareness and kind of inspire action to kind of get things done. Again, it all depends on the not just the power of the interest group, but the influence that it has. So it's like how much it's available to people to understand what they're actually doing, and how much access to government that they actually have. And they'll also provide public officials with specialized information. Like an example is like there's interest groups that actually serve the Supreme Court. And so they don't work for the Supreme Court, but what they'll do is during certain deliberations for particular not legislation, but decisions that are being made by the Supreme Court, what they'll do is they'll put forth all sorts of briefs and everything to give the Supreme Court background information on particular cases and legal justifications, or in order for the Supreme Court to come to their decision. So they're not just kind of drawing only on their past knowledge in order to get things done. People think that actually happens, which would not be to the best benefit of everybody in general. And they also serve as a check on public officials. And so sometimes there's oversight done by interest groups themselves. Some interest groups are nothing but oversight. An example of that, and it's not necessarily just a oversight of government, but oversight of, you know, health and safety in general. You look at I'm forgetting his name at the moment. Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader's Fight Back that was actually done, you know, I think it was back in the 1960s, might have been even the 1950s. And the idea was it was this television process of going on the news and, you know, looking at products to see how they're problematic. And so it's kind of the reason why we have seat belts in cars, is that's a direct, you know, lobbyist group or interest group that he had actually put together, you know, in order to make this sort of thing happen. And they showed the, you know, the frailties in the system, why things needed to be done, and it basically caused not only government regulation, but, you know, even car manufacturers to go, okay, this is really important because, you know, public sentiment is against us, and even if you weren't somebody who, you know, was going to immediately benefit from this, you benefited, you know, kind of as a participant free rider, you know, in the whole process in order to get all of these things done. I mean, that's why every car pretty much in the United States today has a seatbelt in it, as it's just become a natural process of the way you actually create a car. And so there's a couple of theories that are kind of important. One is called the Floralis Theory, which is basically politics is a contest among various interest groups. And so interest groups kind of, you know, help, you know, fuel the whole process of how things actually get done. And influence of groups on government is not undemocratic. No one group can dominate the political process, you know, which is kind of really important, because if you had just one interest group, you basically have like a one political party, you know, which you'd never really want in, you know, a democracy. Well, at least in most democracies. Which is kind of the difference between some of the direct and indirect democracies that we kind of have in the world today, where when people are making definitions of what democracy actually is. So we're talking about the theoreticals rather than the actual applications of what democracy is. So let's talk about political parties, because I just mentioned them. What is the difference between a political party and an interest group? Well, first off, an interest group will have policy specialists. They really know about specific things, whereas a political party will have policy generalists. And what the difference of that means is, you know, a political party has to focus on a whole bunch of different issues that's all part of their platform, whereas an interest group is kind of focused on one or a few things, which is kind of sometimes the reason for the interest group being formed in the first place. Interest groups are tightly organized, whereas political parties are loosely organized. Interest groups are generally financed through the contributions of memberships, whereas political parties, their influence comes from the electoral system itself, actually. For candidates, interest groups, they basically don't compete for public office, but they will support candidates on different issues depending on how those candidates are towards their specific issues. Whereas a political party physically runs candidates for offices. So it's kind of like some of the differences between interest groups and political parties. So let's talk about the different kinds of interest groups. There's trade organizations. These are mostly business interest groups. They're usually less visible. People don't really see too much of those, but they're out there and they're doing their sorts of things. And so sometimes it'll even be, you know, depending on how large a corporation is, it could be an interest group itself. Like Microsoft could be an interest group, or Amazon could be an interest group. based on how huge, the amount of support is that they can generate in order to get the certain things done that they actually want to get done. Some interest groups kind of support both parties sometimes, because it's kind of like, putting your eggs in all baskets, in order to, like, whatever the results come of specific elections, you kind of get everything done. So, which is really interesting, because during elections, people will go, how could this company possibly be for both the Republicans and the Democrats? And they'll think they're, doing all sorts of weird illegal background kinds of things, because Microsoft will support the Republicans, at the same time give money to the Democrats. Well, it's, like I said, it's hedging all bets and that sort of thing. But at the same time, it's because these companies realize is you need to get your support out there regardless of who actually wins. And the whole process requires, especially the amount of money involved in our political system today, a lot of capital in order to get things done. And so supporting all sides tends to cause, like, say, if the Republicans win an election, then those businesses then go, look, we're supporting you and we still need these things done. And so they'll go to that particular side to get the issues they want done. Or if it's the opposite side that tends to be against certain things that they want in their businesses, I'm not saying Republicans or Democrats on any specific issue, but what that'll mean is, they'll try to use their influence to make sure that there's no onerous types of legislation that get pushed forward that actually hurts their business, and they'll use their clout and support because of their previous support in order to kind of get those things done. And so quite often campaign contributions can be made just to avoid political disfavor, kind of like what I was actually saying before. So let's talk about some of the other different types of interest groups. Those are mainly the business ones. There's also labor-intensive groups. One of the most powerful in the United States is the AFLCIO. It's basically a confederation of 56 unions, give or take a few at any time. It represents 9 million organized workers and 3.2 million community affiliates. So basically what these types of organizations, not just in the AFL-CIO, but all sorts of other organizations like this that are labor intensive, is, they work in order to make the, working conditions for people in that particular field as good as physically possible. It makes complete sense. So a lot of times, some of the biggest criticisms against these type of labor organizations is you only really see them when they're on strike. So it's basically when they're having detrimental effects to what's going on in whatever country or manufacturing there is. But I mean, they're doing a whole lot of other things behind the scenes in order to get things kind of done. And so one of the more recent problems with that is there's been a huge decline in unions in the United States. And so there's been which kind of makes the fall in the number of blue collar workers who are unemployed, who basically become unemployed, or they move into different fields. It's also really difficult to form and maintain unions because quite often management has always been against them, right from the very founding of, every company that's been out there. There's been a huge flow in order to keep unions out of them. And so, in the beginning, early days, talking 1800s or so, and even to the early 1900s, is there was all sorts of attempts to, basically physically stop unions from forming. And so, and there's still all sorts of problems with them even today. There's also public sector unions, and they've grown in, number and political clout. One of the more obvious ones, which has been in the news in the 2020 period, which is the whole police unions, because there's a lot of police unions that are involved. And so during the whole Black Lives Matter movement, there were approaches to get the police forces across the country in order to have a little more compliance to, community standards, and huge pushback from the police unions, which has always been one of the detriments to actually trying to get that type of movement going. And so that's always kind of like as the background of what's going on. But like I said, as these unions are more and more powerful, there's a lot of push and pull. And by the end of the day, I can't tell you whether they will be more or less powerful than they were before. Let's talk about professional interest groups. There's another professional interest groups. Let's talk about all sorts of organizations that exist that are all part of like getting something done within their organizations. Historically, we used to call them guilds. And so like a guild, you literally have to join it in order to become part of that profession. So if I wanted to become a tailor, I joined the Tailor Guild. And so in order to get work as a tailor, you literally had to go through the guild, and they would only hire out people with these particular standards that went through the process to do it. And so as that became more and more formalized, those organizations themselves became huge entities and with very onerous standards as to what you needed to do in order to get things done. And so they'd have apprenticeships and all that kind of thing. Well, these things are kind of carried forward, and so a lot of professional interest groups kind of have the same thing. So like if you're looking at where we have those today, we have like the American Medical Association, which is if you want to be a doctor, you basically sign in through that. I mean, you go through the whole process, and there's accreditation processes and accountability processes, and you can literally be out of a medical license, and that's what they have, is they have licensing and to make sure these things happen, and that serves that purpose. Another one is the American Bar Association. So if you want to become an attorney, basically they have that set up as the process. And so they'll even have like the opposite side of it, which is the American Association for Justice, which is, you get the idea of how this works. They all kind of represent the things that they actually want to do. And so in order to become part of the process, you participate in that process. But those organizations, and that's kind of what's important, become interest groups, and they have influence because as an organization with dues and all that they take in, they will hire lobbyists that go to government to try to get those specific things, positive in government's eyes. Other ones, like there's agricultural interest groups, such as the American Farm Bureau Federation, often just referred to as the Farm Bureau, the National Grange, the National Farmers Union. I mean, so we have all of these different things that these are interest groups that came about as agricultural, and so they end up becoming much more powerful than they should have ever thought to be, whereas their influence today is still strong because of those previous inroads to government and power. But then people on the outside would sit there and go, why are farmers so powerful in America? Well, again, we're talking about all that time way back when they were powerful and they were a huge fundamental part of, the structure of getting things done in government. And so, which is why when Congress decides on, budgets every year, there's a certain amount of money that's allocated towards, farmers, which is why during, economic slowdowns, you'll see, the president will often, have to put forth ideas in order to save farmers because they're a huge interest group with a lot of clout and a lot of people supporting them that makes them a lot more powerful than they probably will. An example of that is milk. You would think, why would a industry like milk be so powerful? Well, besides their connection to cereal and the cereal organizations wanting to benefit from, people buying milk, which people kind of forget that's one of their reasons of being so powerful. They serve with those kinds of connections to where the cereal manufacturers, who are a very powerful organization, again, part of the farmers, see how this kind of goes. And so those different labor organizations kind of work together in order to give, cross applications through government to show they want certain things done, and they get certain things done. Whereas in the very end, you start to wonder, why is there a Got Milk campaign? Like, who caused milk to be part of the common conversation? And you realize there's all these connections to other things because they're an interest group with a lot of connections and clout to make things actually happen. There's also consumer interest groups, and I talked a little bit about that before, like the Ralph Nader organization with the Fight Back. Sometimes organizations will deal with, poor housing, discrimination against minorities and women, discrimination in the granting of credit. That's been getting a lot of play very recently. Student college debt. I mean, these are all sorts of things, or business inaction on consumer complaints. I mean, these are all kinds of reasons why people actually come up with different interest groups. So there's a identity on interest groups as to, like, why are they together in the first place, or maybe interest groups such as they stand for identity themselves. There's a long way to come around saying that. Basically, what I mean is, sometimes an interest group, instead of being an organization that's about specific issues, may actually be because people share a common identity. That was a long way to come around to saying that. So, like, give you an example, is like Native American interest groups. So they're interest groups that represent Native Americans. Keeping in mind there are, any number of tribes out there, that have come and gone and that are still around and in different, pockets in different areas, but collectively have found that if they have their interests represented together, they can get a lot more things done, collectively than they can, the Cherokee tribe trying to get something done over here, the Navajo tribe trying to get something done over here, whereas government would look at both of those and go, you're too small for us to make a difference, yet collectively they're huge, which causes government to have to respond to those things. And so therefore they get together and have their own organization, which is an interest group, and collectively decide these are the things we want to focus on, and then they work with government to get those sorts of things done. Historically, unfortunately, Native American groups have not had a whole lot of clout in government, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there were a lot of Freeriders involved in it. Certain Native American groups that just kind of hung on, trying to get some of the results of negotiations that were going on, and as a result, they were fractured, making it very hard to get anything done. It wasn't until they started getting together and realizing their, economic and political clout that they could have together that they started getting some inroads into the things they want done. Still way, way behind a lot of other interest groups out there. All sorts of different, ethnic and gender type of identities out there that are have a lot of clout based off of, their shared desire to get things done. There's also ideological interest groups. Give you an example of one that kind of came and went, but it's still floating out there, and that's the Tea Party movement. There'll be environmental groups, huge push very recently with the Greta Thunberg approach to trying to get things done, the shaming the UN sort of thing, which kind of leads to other things. There's religious groups. They have their own ideological interest groups as well. And so I saw about some of the different types of interest groups again. Like there's single issue interest groups. like I said, they're only really specifically focused on one thing. I mentioned Mothers Against Drunk Driving, often referred to as MAD. There's also the Right to Life organization, and NORAL, Pro-Choice America. The NRA, very specific, one issue kind of interest groups. There's government interest groups. Efforts by state and local governments to lobby the federal government is increased, which is, again, has its own ramifications as you look at it. There's also direct and indirect techniques that lobbyists actually use in order to get things done. So a direct technique is basically lobbying. You go to the government and you try to get things done. You'll have whoever your person is that's an influential person will actually try to get government to do certain things. So a lot of defense manufacturers would hire former generals, so those generals have a connection to government, have a connection to the military industrial complex, so they could kind of get things done. So I mean, those types of things, or somebody who was previously working for the government or working for a particular political party. And so they'll use those kind of people who they hire and use them to lobby government. They'll also provide election support. Go for this particular legislation and, we'll back you when it comes to an election. Or we'll write all of your constituents and let them know you're doing a great job, or we'll write all your constituents and tell them you're doing a crappy job. And so these are some types of the influence that are actually used with that. We also have what's called political action committees. And these are organizations that raise funds to make campaign contributions. The amount of money PACs that spend on elections for every election has grown astronomically. It's almost completely out of control. There were a couple attempts back in the 1980s and a few attempts after that in order to curtail them. But basically the Supreme Court has kind of shot down most of it, and even some of the things that they succeeded in doing got shot down by Congress, a couple of years later. So remember, you're telling a bunch of people that you can't influence government, and the people who are trying to stop you from doing that are influencing government. So kind of figure out the math on how that actually kind of works out. There's indirect techniques. They'll influence policy through third parties or the general public. Officials are kind of impressed by contacts from voters, so they really like to hear from voters when they can. Sometimes they discontinue talking to voters, and part of the problem is the larger or the higher up in government they become, the less connection to the public that they actually are. So literally the only time there's any connection to a political official ends up being through interest groups who represent a lot of people. Other indirect techniques include shaping public opinion. They'll write letters to the editor in newspapers, or they'll go to whatever trade publication happens to be followed by a particular political party or candidate or anything, and make all sorts of inroads through that. Also have rating systems, such as they'll say this, candidate is, an A plus, this is a C minus based off of, how much this person does stuff that we actually like. And so, and then that kind of helps their followers, whoever's, or members of their lobbyist group, go, we support this person or we don't support this person, or we support this party or we don't support this party. A couple other indirect techniques include issue ads or 527s, so based on the regulation that allows them to do certain things. So that's TV or radio ads that take a position on a particular issue. They'll mobilize constituents, which is urge members to contact their government officials. One of the more recent things that's kind of has its own dubious connections, which means, I don't mean as in dishonorable, dubious, but dubious as in I don't know how much influence it really has. And that's using like internet campaigns in order to get things done, because like George W. Bush had actually mentioned when he was president, that's just another interest group. And so it's, if they're not paying attention to it and see, 1,000,000 people is one vote against them, that's kind of how they see it sometimes, then you have to be kind of wary of that, so that a huge movement online sometimes is not taken seriously. And there's still a kind of a disconnect between whether online really is honest or dishonest, or can be swayed by all sorts of technical sorts of things. Demonstrations is another thing. There was a huge Occupy movement during the latter period of the Obama administration. The protests and rallies during the Trump administration have been huge moves in order to get future legislation done, and lobbyists will respond to this, or they will generate all sorts of connections to government based off of some of the things that actually happen. And so you'll see a lot of, not necessarily change, but you'll see a lot of influence kind of coming out of stuff like that. And so sometimes violent demonstrations become a part of, how a lobbyist group actually works, because sometimes people aren't listening to, people who are not violent. And it takes violence sometimes in order to get, people to even pay attention in the first place, which the problem with that is, which should be kind of obvious, but it's not, is the more violent demonstrations become, the more violence it requires to gain a connection to officials to pay attention to it. So, and it can kind of desensitize government to one violent act after another, to where you have to do serious violence in order to get things done. So again, it can be, I hate to use slippery slopes as an argument, but it can be a slippery slope. In order to get things done, you must make things a lot worse. So that is one of the stipulations to trying to get things done that particular way. So over time, interest groups tend to get really bad result or bad press, because people see interest groups as kind of corrupt, whereas they're part of the system, and people kind of forget that. And so they're never really viewed as favorable. And so quite often politicians will run on the whole idea that I'm not influenced by interest groups, which you should kind of think about when you hear that, because that may tell you that I'm set in my own ways and I'm not going to change my mind on anything, which would be a really concerning thing if that's how all of your representatives actually were. So there needs to be a fine line between them, but finding it can sometimes be more problem than anything else. So today, they tried to, not just today, but in recent times, they've tried to regulate a lot of these interest groups, or interest groups over time. And starting back from 1946, there was the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act. It was basically anyone receiving money to influence legislation was registered with the clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate. Kind of worked, but sometimes people influence people without actually saying what they are, and so there's a lot of disconnect between what gets reported and what should get reported. Anyone registering must identify employer, salary, amount and purpose of expenses, and duration of employment. And every registered lobbyist must make quarterly reports. But then there are lobbyists out there that don't register, and that becomes a part of the problem. So anyone violating the act can be fined, and some organizations have actually found it's more beneficial to not report their stuff and get fined, and then kind of balance their sheets at the end with, we're expected to pay a certain amount of fines, and that's never a good thing, but it's been part of the process. So there were attempts to kind of fix that with the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995. And so it basically reformed the 1946 Act. And it defined who must register with the clerk or secretary to try to like go, look, we realize here's some of the problems and we're trying to deal with it. And so now lobbyists must report clients, issues they lobbied, and the agency and chamber of Congress they contacted. Again, it's been since 1995 that this was enacted, but it's still kind of debatable as to whether or not any, solutions were actually found from that. So there's been recent reform attempts to get bundled campaign contributions to be reported. And again, a lot of those issues end up in the Supreme Court or being argued up to the Supreme Court. Expenditures must be reported as well. Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, that was a very recent one, which increased lobbying disclosure. It requires disclosure of lawmakers' requests for earmarks. Remember, a lot of these have a lot to do with, Congress deciding at one specific moment they didn't like things that were done just a few years ago, and then try to get accountability, and then sometimes a new Congress will come along and try to get rid of some of the onerous approaches to stop things happening the way they have. So let's talk about the last few administrations, such as during the Obama administration. Obama pledged that lobbyists won't find a job in his White House, or I think his quote was, "Lobbyists won't find a job in my White House." And so the pledge turned out to be unenforceable. Senior administration officials included lobbyists, so they basically hired people that were lobbyists, so kind of defeated their reason for doing it in the first place. And the White House staff members found ways to get around restrictions. And that's part of the problem, is like when you build loopholes in some of the requirements, people will use them. That's kind of to be expected. People are people, politics are politics. So some people considered Obama's policies towards lobbyists absurd, so it didn't work out as planned. And then there was, let's talk about more recent, which is the Trump administration. When running for office, he pledged to clean out the swamp. Well, that works really well, but in theory, but lobbyists target the administrators of either party. And so it doesn't really matter, which party we're talking about. And so it was basically trying to be enforced on one party rather than another. So the results of it didn't actually come out the way it was intended, or the perception was intended, I guess. And so there's different influencers, same problem. Less oversight makes it really difficult to target any of the swamp. So think about that. I mean, what happened was, okay, we're going to clean out the swamp, but then basically took all of the oversight away from, the administrators that would actually do this in the first place. So basically cleaning out the swamp became kind of impossible. And so that's kind of where we are today. So that's literally the process of what happens with lobbyists in America and the thing behind it. It's sometimes like I said, it's seen as like a dirty set of words in American government, but lobbyists are part of the system. Remember, they were originally set up as something that should be there as part of the First Amendment, and they naturally grew as the government became bigger and bigger. When you're looking at the way things work, that's how they actually work. As government became bigger, you needed some way in order to, respond to government. And lobbyists have kind of served as the mechanism to actually do that. So they're not a horrible thing or a bad thing. They're just something that you have to understand are part of the system and work with that part of the system in order to get the things done that need to be done.